Hello, this video is all about how we've created the music of Kenshi and why we made the decisions that we did. So let's start right at the beginning. The discussions between myself, Kole, and the main developer, Chris, fortunately, we ended up having a lot of the same ideas as far as instrumentation, atmosphere, and the role that music should play in the game. But we still had to iron out a few details before I began writing the actual music notes. So I started asking questions like, what should combat music sound like, or should there even be combat music? After a quick back and forth, we came to a few conclusions. The music should be a direct representation of the world, rather than the characters or tribulations they're going through. Chris made it very clear that this is a harsh world to live in, and it really doesn't care if you build your own bustling town, slay a group of bandits when the odds are against you, or even if you die. It just doesn't care. And not because it's mean, so the music isn't overly dark, or light. Rather, it's because the world is huge and you are just tiny in the grand scheme of things. So, with this musical indifference, we settled on a few general guidelines for the music to always follow. It shall never intentionally react or respond to anything happening in the game. Anytime it does is pure coincidence. And in a way, the world is singing or composing its own song. You're just an observer. So this means none of the traditional game music structures, the ambient layers, stealth, or combat music are really necessary here. However, with all of this said, we decided that we still wanted to vary the emotional spectrum and the instrumental palette as the player visits new biomes. So the instruments you hear and the melodic and harmonic material of the sweeping sand mountains of the dunes would be quite different than that of the savanna. This is about as interactive as the music system gets. Now then, how would we go about creating a music system for a world that doesn't care if you live or die? Well, fortunately, I'm working with something called Wise, or W-Wise, which has really allowed me to create the music system we desired. Beyond the main goal of creating a music system that's really indifferent to your well-being, we decided that loops in the traditional sense of the word that's defined in game music wouldn't be appropriate for Kenshi. So you'll never hear the same music track loop back to back to back again. We want to keep the musical palette fresh and composition unexpected and almost improvisational in a way, as you should be roaming the desert sands or whatever biome it is for quite a while with your merry band of mercenaries. So how would we do that? Well, I approached our music system with the idea of creating 3 musical layers that are both independent of and yet can interweave easily with one another. To keep it consistent, we made sure that the instrumental palette works for specific biomes, and we pick a specific tempo and key to have all of the music be played in. However, the meter can change as it's not necessarily set to 4/4 or whatever meter we chose at any one time. And in many cases, it's really a little bit unimportant because it can feel rubato. So, what are these layers? Well, I broke them into 3 categories. First, the beds. These are the foundational layers of ambient or pad type music. They're usually a little longer in duration, anything from 1, 2, or maybe even 3 minutes long, and they define the tonal center. This is also the only layer that has musical tracks both for the daytime and the nighttime, of course changing on the biome. Just to add in a bit more variation, the second layer is what I call the frame layer. And this is comprised of musical material of all kinds of durations, anything from 5 to 10 seconds to a full minute long, but they're always shorter than the beds. They're meant to be a kind of compositional framework that doesn't strongly pull you in one direction, just something a little bit more than the bed layer. So frames are usually comprised of single chords within the key we chose for that biome, progressions, rhythms, or perhaps even special extended techniques on an instrument. Last but not least, we have the top layer of our music system, which I call the canopy layer. All of the musical material in this layer is quite a bit shorter than the beds, and usually shorter than the frames. It mainly contains single motifs, entire melodies, or perhaps even chord melodies, depending on the instrument. I definitely consider this layer to be the strongest at pulling the heartstrings, if you will, or at the very least leading the music to a specific emotional location. All three of these layers are independent of one another and yet can interact to create something bigger than themselves. However, it's all randomly chosen by the game. That's why I like to say the game is playing or composing its own soundtrack. I've composed specific chords, melodies, and rhythms for it, and then recorded those, but the game chooses and decides which ones to play and, of course, when to play them. Sometimes we'll only hear the bed layer. Other times, all three will come in at once, picking randomly which ones to play, and it'll sound really dissonant or fantastically emotional and deeper than I could have even expected. Other times, it's just silent, and all you'll hear is the wind. So how do you go about composing for a system like this? It's definitely a little bit beyond traditional. First and foremost, I had to establish the instrumental palettes for the biomes and define what instruments would be found in which layer. Sometimes they could be found in multiple layers. So Chris and I went through all the various biomes in the game, or eventually to be in the game, and figured out what we wanted it to sound like. For example, for the dunes, we feature a lot of electric guitar through various amps, fretless bass, harmonica, and other instruments. We wanted to make it feel kind of like an arid and hot, lonely spaghetti western vibe, a little bit of that Ennio Morricone flavor. Now for the frame and canopy layers, it was pretty easy. Instruments that were capable of melodies were put in the canopy layer, and those able to do at least 2 notes at the same time were more fit into the frame layer. However, there are instruments capable of both, like the electric guitar, so you can hear both in the frame and canopy layer, sometimes mixed on top of each other. And for all of these layers, I took care in writing not only unique and emotionally evocative parts that can just play on their own, but can also mix relatively well with the other layers. Sure, since our system has randomness to it, we'll eventually get a combination that may be more dissonant than we anticipated, but in the grand scheme of the world and the overall vibe we're going for, it actually works quite well. Contrarily, the music system has already combined different parts that I haven't even thought of doing yet, and it sounds way better than I thought. Whether it was a chord progression, a melody, and a rhythm combination I haven't tried before, or just even shifting that motif over to beat 2 rather than the downbeat. But what about the beds? Well, for the beds, I took a slightly different approach than writing tiny black dots or musical notes and handing them to musicians. For the beds, I sampled tons of actual instruments playing specific pitches, articulations, or techniques, and then I brought that into a great program called Iris from Isotope and picked what frequencies I liked from that sample. And then after mixing it with various other samples and adding things like reverb, delay, chorus, something like that, Iris then mapped out my new instrument to the keyboard. I then improvised within the key and tempo of the overall tune, if you will, even though we don't have a traditional tune, and made something work for that specific biome and the time of day it was supposed to represent. These new instrument pads, mixed with a few great patches from other synths, really helped me create the sound that I wanted for the bed layer. Each one really screams Kenshi, as it's all quite unique. After everything's been recorded, I found some specific reverbs, delays, and distortions that I liked, and they could be easily applied to each layer in Pro Tools. Keeping the sound consistent even through the instruments, the keys, and tempos will differ as the player changes biomes, so after bouncing tons of individual parts for each of the 3 layers, I integrated them into Ys or WYs and mixed them relative to one another so that one part would never be overly loud or dominant compared to the others. They should all sit in the same space. Then making sure that the game would randomly play silence was really important as well. We don't want the music to get overly repetitive and these giant vast landscapes that you're going through. We want it to sound, well, empty sometimes. So it's okay to have silence. We want the world to create its own song, but would like to give it a little bit of direction or shape so the emotional curve isn't static. Okay, enough chatter. It's time for a demo. So there you have it, our music system for Kenshi. The world of Kenshi is a tough place to live in, and it doesn't care about your well-being. So we created a system that allowed the world to express whatever it wanted, separate from the player's input. This is counteractive to all of the interactivity usually in game music, but something that we feel works quite well and makes Kenshi feel unique. We hope you enjoy, and oh, by the way, this is just the in-game music system. That's not to say it'll be the only music you'll hear while roaming through the world of Kenshi though. But I'll save all of that for another video. Thanks for watching and listening.